Yes. But I'm thrilled that you all took the opportunity to come in out of this beautiful weather to hear Honey, and you're not going to be disappointed, I know. Many of you know Honey, and I don't know if any of you have read the book yet, but I have, and it's, I think, the best one yet. They just keep getting better and better, but I'm fascinated by this one, so I will turn it over to Honey and enjoy, and as soon as Honey finishes, there'll be time for questions, and then we'll eat some lunch, and you can have Honey sign and talk, and we'll even make a place so she can sit down and eat lunch too.
Oh, Karen, thank you so much.
Oh, you are welcome.
It's always a pleasure to come in and speak with all of you. Many of you I know, many of you I don't, so I hope you'll come up to me afterwards and introduce yourself. I'd love to meet you. I'm going to start out. If I sit down, can everybody see me?
I can.
Okay. You? I'll move around maybe. I'm going to start out by doing something a little bit different this time. I usually just plow right into my book. I'd like to address the two questions that are asked of me most often. And the first is, how long have you been writing? Have you been writing a long time? Or did you suddenly just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to write a series of books that take place in Seaside? Well, that would be a very ambitious project and one I didn't do. I have been writing for many, many years, almost all my life. I've been writing since I was 7 years old, which is probably the earliest you can possibly start, because I don't think you could really learn how to put sentences together before that. But as soon as I put sentences in, I was writing stories. I was writing books. And I tell people it's who I am and what I do. And I absolutely love it. Spent not all my summers, but a lot of my summers in Seaside as a child. Came with my mom and my grandmother and my uncle. And I have wonderful, wonderful memories of Seaside growing up. This is my paradise, and luckily I married a man who also has wonderful memories here in Seaside as a child. And so we're both very fortunate. And so we're both very fortunate to be here. Even as a child, I would come and I would bring a very, very thick notepad, and I would write stories taking place in Seaside. And so, yes, I've been writing for a very, very long time. The other question that I get asked a lot is, do you have a favorite book? You have 3 books out, you have 4 books out, now you have 5 books out, you must have a favorite. Well, I guess that's a little bit like asking a mother who has 5 children, do you have a favorite? And she better not say yes. I love all my books in different ways, probably like a mother would love all of her children in different ways. They all have worth, they all mean something to me, they're all important to me in one way or another. The very first book that I wrote is the first book in the trilogy that takes place in Seaside, and it's called 1,000 Summers. And that had to have been so exciting after all these years to finally hold a book in my hand that was published. And I couldn't believe it, because I wanted this my entire life. And so that was important to me because of that. The story was also very important. A lot of people like to read stories that take place where they live or where they vacation, so that was good. But for me personally, I wanted to write a book that had the 3 people that meant most to me growing up, and that was my mom and my grandmother give them in a place that the four of us love so much. And so the book has my mother in it. It has bits and pieces of my grandmother in it, and it has my Uncle Bernie in it, who became Bernard. I gave him the leading role, and he was in each of the books of the trilogy. It also had a boy in it that I had a mad crush on growing up. His name was Bruce, and I kept his name Bruce in the book. His parents were very close friends of my mom and dad's. And I also had a very special friend that I borrowed in the book. Her name was Patty Jo. And the friend is the main character's best friend in the book. And she's a combination of my cousin, Paula, who is 8 months younger than I, and my very best friend when we were 12 and 13 years old. And she's here today with her mom. And they came in and surprised me from Overland. And so between those two characters, I hope you don't mind if I borrowed you for my book. But we write about what we know about. And so between those two characters, I put them together and they became Patty Jo. So that book is very special for a lot of different reasons. Also, a lot of the book is my story, my personal story. The second book to the trilogy is Secrets of the Cove, and it's about 4 women who meet every single Tuesday, same restaurant, sit at the same table, but they each have a very dark secret that they feel that they cannot share with anyone, including one another. And even though I created these women, my heart really went out to them, and I really was drawn to the problems people have when they carry such deep, dark secrets. And we all do, from about one thing or another, and one time in our life or another. So that became the second book, and I loved that one. The third book of the trilogy was very different. It was a darker story. It was maybe a little bit more out of this world, but it still had quirky characters in it, and it still had Bernard in it. Bernard went from book to book, and he was certainly in the third book of the trilogy. And but even though it was almost a genre that I'd never written before, it still fit in with the trilogy, and I felt that it was a perfect ending as the third book of the trilogy. The fourth book came in. That came out last summer, and that was a book I never wanted to write, and I hoped and prayed I'd never have to write. It is about my struggle raising our son Brian. He had some mental issues and was never diagnosed. In 9 years, we had taken him to 9 different therapists. We had him hospitalized twice for being suicidal. We finally turned over custody to the state of Oregon and placed him in a group home that was supposed to be a 6 to 9 month program, and he was there for almost a year and a half. And for the last 10 years of his life, we were really estranged from him because we finally just had to walk away. So I didn't want to write the book, but even on the day that we got the phone call that he had passed away, I had friends and family with me and said, "You have to write this book." And I said, "No." I says, "I'm not going to write it." I says, "It doesn't have a happy ending and nobody would want to read it." And they all argued with me and said, "No, you will write it." And so in 2 months the book was finished. In 1 month I wrote the first draft, and in the second month I wrote the second draft, and it was done. Usually takes me a year and a half to write a book. So it kind of gives you some perspective. I didn't have to make up anything. I didn't have to create anything. It was there. I just had to write it down. So that book is a very intense book, and it's a difficult read, but people are loving it, and I'm very, very glad that I wrote it. And then that brings me up to The Faithful Daughter. And I guess I have to agree with Karen. I think this tugs at me a little bit more. This story is based on stories I heard growing up from my mom and from my grandmother. My great-great-grandfather was one of the early rabbis, Orthodox rabbis in Denver, Colorado. And he was an extremely poor man. They opened up their house as a boarding house to try to make ends meet. He was an extremely Orthodox man. He ruled his family with such an iron fist that his children really felt as though they were suffocating in their father's religion. And they all rebelled in one way or another, except my grandmother. My grandmother had a sister who was very, very active in the communist movement. She later raised her children and grandchildren to also join the Communist Party. She organized many, many communist rallies, was arrested many times, was jailed many times, and this did not go over too well with the rabbi. My grandmother had a brother who, along with his wife, opened up a saloon in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. That didn't go over too well with the rabbi. But the biggest affront to my great-great-grandfather and his religion was when one of his sons married out of the faith. And as the young people would say now, he went ballistic. And what he did was he actually said the prayer for the dead for his son. And he ordered his family not to ever mention this boy's name again in his house. And so I have all these bits and pieces of notes from all these stories and all these things that I learned. And I did research on dates and times and got birth and death certificates and that sort of thing. And I became fascinated with the story. And of course, I wanted to write a book on it. But like most stories that we all have in our family, you have to add something to it, give it a little oomph, and to really make it a great novel. So I thought, okay, so I'll put all those facts together. One other fact that I had was that I actually have an article that was written by a journalist in the Denver, from the Denver Post. He interviewed my great-great-grandfather, wrote an article. And as I said, I should have brought it today, but I do have the original article. I don't know anything about this journalist. I assume it's a man. In my mind, he's young. And I'm thinking, what if I make him the main character of my book? Well, that's, that took a lot of imagination, but I thought, what if I built this world around him and my great-grandmother, and my grandmother? What if he didn't just come to interview my great-grandfather for an afternoon and write one article, what if he kept returning to the house over and over and over again to meet with the rabbi? And what if he wrote a series of articles that would keep him in the house longer? And what if he was there long enough to fall in love with my grandmother, who was the favorite daughter? And what if this journalist's name was Peter Andrews, not a Jewish name? How would that play out? And what would be the dynamics of the family? And how would Peter react, knowing he's in love with this daughter, the favorite daughter, and yet he has seen what already has happened with her, her name is Rebecca, with Rebecca's brother, and how he's been basically declared dead in the family. How can he pursue this woman? So that's the crux of the book. And so it's a romance. It's not a kissy, sweet, you know, like some of them are. I like to think there's a little bit more meat in this book. It's a historical novel. It follows the years of, starts in 1912 and it ends in 1957. This is a picture of my grandmother in her wedding dress on the cover, and she got married when she was 19 years old. This is partly her story, but it's kind of a what if this had happened with all these other dynamics around it, what would have happened? What would have played out? How would she have reacted? And this is kind of my shuffling her life around and what I believe possibly could have happened. I make my grandfather a really, really horrible man, and in reality, I never met my grandfather, but I understand he's a wonderful, wonderful man, and they had a very wonderful marriage, although it was a very short marriage. He had heart trouble, and for many, many years was very, very ill. They were only married for 25 years, and he died when he was only 50 years old. So, but I, you know, we all write about what we know about, and this was a story that had been tugging at me quite a while. For those who read my memoir, Just Breathe, you'll know that I actually started this book many, many years ago. It got me through some really, really tough times. It was my escape through many, many tough years with our son, and I pulled it out the last several months and began to finish it up. So I hope you all enjoy it. I'm going to do some reading from